Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with the Zimmermann Telegram, a history by Barbara W. Tuchman that was originally published in 1958. I decided to read this, because I have read some of Barbara Tuchman's stuff, not this one, many, many, many years ago, and have had it on my radar to revisit her work. And then this particular incident in history was mentioned in the book Code Girls, which I read recently by Liza Monday and chatted here on my channel, so I will link to that chat down in the details below. But it was just really interesting to me about this code-breaking effort back in World War I that surrounded the Zimmermann Telegram that I will describe a little bit more here in a bit. So how this book is basically structured, it describes events leading up to the telegram, and then the reasons why it was sent, and then the aftermath of the telegram as it became more publicly known. So I thought I would kind of just structure my chat this way. I'm not qualified to teach this subject or this book, for that matter, as a history lesson, but I think what I'll do is I'll go through each of those sort of main topics and pull out just some of the most interesting ideas that I found while reading this book. Okay, so the events leading up to the Zimmermann Telegram, this is taking place during the World War I era. So around 1914 to 1918 is the years of the war, I believe. The United States was neutral. It was not only neutral, it was fiercely neutral, staunchly neutral. The president was neutral, the Congress was neutral, and the American public wanted to remain neutral during the war. So throughout the course of the war, the U.S. had been neutral. We had this relationship with Mexico at this time that was very troubled. Mexico had had a revolution a few years prior where a general named Huerta had seized power and was not recognized by President Wilson. And then there was other sorts of political turmoil. This was the era of Pancho Villa later on. And at the U.S., it even had like this military intervention in Veracruz that was really a disaster for the U.S. diplomatically. And, the Pancho Villa thing, the U.S. President Wilson eventually sent in General Pershing to basically chased Pancho Villa all over Mexico. I don't think he ever caught him, but there was very strained relations between the U.S. and Mexico. So Germany in World War I, Germany wanted the U.S. to remain neutral because they knew that if the U.S. entered into the war, they would enter on the side of the Allies, Britain and France and others, and that would tip the balance of power then. And so it was in Germany's interest to keep the U.S. occupied with Mexico. Then there was this idea of the Yellow Peril. This was another interesting thing, very racist, but the Yellow Peril was this idea of Japan's growing influence in the Pacific as a threat to European power, and also specifically the Germans wanted the Americans to think of it as a threat to their power in the Pacific. And so the Yellow Peril, there was a concern in the U.S. about Japan's relationship with Mexico. Japan had some of course, had their own ties with Mexico, and there was a fear that Japan was going to create a military base, a naval base in Baja California, if I remember right. And so there was this anxiety around the Yellow Peril and around Japan during this era. So why was the telegram sent? So the Germans had decided at this point in the war, we're in like the end of 1916, they decide that they are going to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare on the world's oceans, and it would begin on February 1st. Germany at this time had supremacy in this kind of submarine technology, and so they knew that there was a risk, though, that once this unrestricted means that they were going to sink any kind of ship that they thought was aiding the Allies. So the U.S. was neutral, so the U.S. sold arms and things like that to Britain and France, as well as food and things like that. They, being a neutral power, they could sell to anybody, right? But this would put this sort of shipping in jeopardy. And so they knew that there was a risk that the U.S. would actually enter the war once this unrestricted submarine warfare was unleashed. So they had this idea that they would approach Mexico with an offer for them to enter the war. Mexico was also neutral. Enter the war on the side of Germany, which would draw the attention of the Americans and keep the Americans occupied with Mexico, and therefore prevent them from really getting involved really in the European theater, right? And then also to approach Japan. Japan was also at this point allied loosely with the Allies side, so to switch sides and join Mexico in this endeavor. And so as a compensation, when the war was over and Germany and thereby Mexico and Japan had won, Mexico would be given territory that had previously been owned by Mexico, would be given this territory back, specifically Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, these 3 U.S. states. Yeah, the telegram, I'll put it here. So this telegram was intercepted by British intelligence in room 40, which I think is so kind of cool. Room 40 was what this office was known as, that did this sort of decoding work. And they knew they had a hot potato on their hands, but they didn't really want to disclose it to the U.S. because it would also thereby let the Germans know that the British had the capability of cracking their code. At this point, the Germans did not know that the British were actually listening in on them. And so to give up this information, of course, is a risk, right? So they didn't really want to release it. So they held on to the telegram for several weeks before ultimately the decision was made. Well, after the unrestricted warfare started on February 1st, then the decision was made to release it to some U.S. officials, and their first reaction was to not believe it. It just seemed too unreal for them to really grasp it, but eventually they were convinced of its legitimacy, and so it was then made public to Congress as well as the American public. We made newspapers and things like that. Of course, it made headlines. People didn't really believe it, though. There was a lot of disbelief around this. For some people, it felt like the British had made this up in order to convince the U.S. to enter the war, but that it wasn't true. They didn't realize how it could be true. This, however, was all put to rest once Zimmermann himself, an ambassador for Germany in the U.S., actually in a press conference confirmed that the telegram was actually genuine. I cannot imagine why a diplomat would do this, knowing full well the confusion that was being caused about its legitimacy, which was causing a really reluctant Congress, president, and public to enter the war. They were basically looking for any reason at all not to join the war. And this guy, Zimmermann, actually gets out in public and says, oh, no, it's real. So, of course, he announced that, I believe, in March of 1917. And by April of 1917, the U.S. was in the war then. The most interesting aspects, I think, of this book to me were the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. At this time, I didn't really realize it. I didn't really know the story of Pancho Villa. I had heard of it, but I didn't really know the details of how that all had happened and the U.S.'s response to it. Pancho Villa actually did a raid into an American town across the border into New Mexico at one time. He seems like he was kind of a wild character. I'd kind of like to learn a little bit more about Pancho Villa, but that was a really interesting aspect to me. And then another really interesting aspect to me as a guy who grew up during the Cold War in the United States, during a period of time when the U.S. was anything but isolationist, how the U.S. could be so isolationist and neutral at the time. The culture has just shifted. After World War II, the U.S. is no longer this sort of isolationist, neutral country. but it spent a lot of its history as not only isolationist, but really, really, really neutral, wanting to hold on to that neutrality at all costs. And to me, that's really interesting how the culture has shifted over the last 100 years there. And then another really interesting part to me was the information network at the time, sort of the spy network, the code breaking of the era. New York City at the time seems to have been this hotbed of spies. To me, that part of the book was just really interesting and intriguing to read. And then, finally, this Room 40 and the code breakers of Britain at this time. I think that's really interesting. The book didn't go into it in too great a detail here, but nevertheless, it was really interesting to me how these information, telegrams, and things like wireless communication had to pass through multiple countries sometimes to get to its destination, because the transatlantic cable had been cut by the British really early on in the war for Germany, but Germany could send messages through neutral parties like Sweden or the US and get them where they needed to go. So that part of information exchange to me was also super interesting. So I really did enjoy this book a lot. It's very readable. Barbara Tuchman was a great popularizer of history, so very easy to read for the general public, in my opinion. I found it really, really a lot of fun, and I do plan on getting to some more of her histories here in the future, so stay tuned for that. But I think I'll leave this particular chat here. My next chat is going to be some Soviet-era Russian science fiction. Lame Fate, Ugly Swans by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. I have finished this book already, and I will have a chat on it coming up soon. So until next time, take care.